to welcome those of you who have just joined us, and for those of you who were here in the first session, welcome back. Just a couple of technical points to start off with. The seminar will be conducted in English because that's what I speak. If you have any technical issues, I have my good colleague Svetlana next to me, so please, if you have any problems or you have any questions about technical issues or certificates and that kind of thing, please address those in the chat in Russian. Anything that you wish me to address or discuss, questions, etc., please do so in English. I will keep an eye on the chat as best I can, and also we'll collect questions, and at the end of this particular session, I will do my best to make sure I give an answer as best I can. If, of course, during the seminar I do not have time to answer every single thing, and it depends on the nature of the question, and it depends on what we're talking about, you are always free to mail us at Yexpress Publishing or at Prosvещение. I will try and remember to put my email into the chat for you before the end. So if there's anything you feel I didn't answer completely, you are very, very welcome to drop me a line, and we can discuss it further at some other point. I don't avoid questions, it's just sometimes they're either not appropriate to the general discussion, or we simply don't have the time to answer everything. But these webinars are a great way of getting in touch with people around the whole of the Federation, and it's a wonderful way of reaching places that maybe it's not so easy for us to get to on a regular basis. So you are very welcome. I see we have people from all over the place. Today I'm sitting in rather a sunny Moscow, enjoying a very bright, if slightly cold November morning. I hope wherever you are that your day is going well, and I thank you for sharing some of it with me. What we're going to be talking about in this session is an idea that we are playing around with at the moment, that we feel is very important in the classroom. In the first session, we talked a little bit about a theory called gamification, which is another theory that we are looking into the practical application of and applying practically. In this session, we are looking at ideas connected to Clil. If you know Yexpress Publishing material and our joint projects with Prosvещение, you will know that many of our course books include a Clil section. It's usually towards the end of the module, and what you will find there is usually some content that relates to another course, another subject, excuse me, within the school, be it maths, geography, history, so on and so forth. What we're going to be looking at in this session is the idea of Clil at primary level, and the way that can be taught and achieved, and above all, why we should bother in the first place with trying to teach Clil at primary level, using it as a tool, and some of the issues that are concerned there. So there will be a discussion in general on the principles of Clil and why it's important, and also we'll be looking at the practical applications. The examples I will be taking are from a new course that we are currently producing. It is a course called I Wonder, a 6-level course at primary level, and the whole course takes a very strongly kind of Clil approach to the teaching of English as a foreign language. If there are any questions about that, as I said, towards the end, please do feel free either now or drop us a line. What I want to do then to start off with is to give a little bit of a background to this whole concept of Clil, talk a little bit about the history of it and what it's supposed to achieve. I am going to try and be, as usual, as honest as I possibly can be with you. I do think that Clil, as a general theory, raises certain issues. As a teacher, I have questions, and I will throw them there out to you guys for your discussion. But generally speaking, we find Clil to be a very positive thing to use in the classroom, and I will try and explain how that will work, and hopefully the benefits that as teachers you might be able to pass on to your students by using this methodology in your classroom. So where does Clil come from? First of all, I am assuming most of you know what it means, but because sometimes people forget, Clil is an acronym. It stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. Content and Language Integrated Learning. The general philosophy of Clil as a methodology started to be explored in the early 90s. It was certainly discussed and debated, I think it was around 1994. And basically what Clil was trying to do was to solve what is a problem for most, certainly teachers of language, if not all subject teachers, and that very much is the question of time. Also for language teachers, it's the question of exposure to language. I am assuming that you, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues who are with us today, thank you very much, Natalia. Spot on. The problem we face as language teachers is always that we have a lot of language to teach and usually not very much time in which to teach it. What Clil basically tried to do was to look at ways in which language learning can be extended outside the classroom into core subjects, in a way kind of letting language learning invade the rest of the curriculum. And what that would do, and this is certainly the idea behind it, is to ensure that learners spend more contact time with the language and they gain more exposure to the language than it is possible to do in the normally timetabled hours set aside for the study of the language in a school. I should stress that Clil, as a language teaching idea, is nothing just to do with English. It's to do with any language. We're going to talk about it from the aspect of English, but it could arguably and quite rightly be used for any foreign language learners are studying. So let's get down to some definitions and what it's talking about and how it might apply in a kind of, if you like, an ideal situation. What we're going to look at to start off with is the ideal situation and the principles themselves, and then we'll move into issues and practical applications. You have a number of definitions I'd like to share with you, and as Natalia quite rightly points out, Clil refers to teaching subjects such as science, history, and geography to students through the medium of a foreign language. Content and language is integrated. Pupils learn a subject through the medium. So, for example, good morning, Kaliningrad. For example, if you have the English language class, and then you also maybe study science in English, or history or geography or whatever in English, the idea is that the language would spread out into those core subjects, as I said, providing more time and more exposure to the language. Another very important element of this whole thing is that, in a way, the focus changes. And this is a very important part of Clil theory. So in the language classroom, you would still analyze, discuss, and teach the various aspects of language that we've always been teaching, including, of course, things like grammar and developing vocabulary, so on and so forth. The idea is, though, that in the core subject classroom, let's say history, for argument's sake, that the history teacher would teach history in English, but would not explicitly discuss the language, so that the learners in the lesson would focus on the subject. They would focus on learning their history. All the effort would go into that, and that the language, the focus would be much more on the fluency of the language, not on the analysis and the specific targeted teaching of the language. Don't worry about being late to the seminar. It's perfectly fine, Natalia, but obviously you have to stay behind during the break and do some extra homework. So there. Obviously, I'm only joking. You're very welcome to join us today. Clil has come something of a buzzword. There are many, many, many theories that involve some aspects of Clil. Please don't panic. We're not going to go through all of these, but we just wanted to share them with you a little bit. What all of these have in common is this idea that language learning is not just about learning about the language, it's the teaching and the learning of the content that language is seen as a medium for learning. And that's a very important part of this whole process. So if we take my example of history, if you were discussing whatever historical elements, facts you wanted to discuss, for example, the feudal system in Europe, hello there. If you were discussing the feudal system in Europe, for example, you wouldn't stop the discussion to correct your learners' misuse of the past perfect, for example. You would just let that discussion carry on. The discussion about the past perfect would take place in the language classroom. So there's a very different kind of emphasis here. The focus in the core subject is on fluency in content, in the language classroom on analysis and specific teaching. So there is the kind of the difference between the two. So just to give you a summary of some of the points I've made so far, and hopefully at the end, if there are still questions about this, we will have a little time to discuss them, hopefully. Language is integrated into the broader curriculum to increase contact with the language. Natural language is seen in context. This is very important. In the first session, we were talking about gamification as one method of increasing motivation among our students. It was felt, and I think there is some truth to this, that if you make language, you use language for what it was made for. If you use language, so for example, for communication, for learning, for asking questions, for providing information, for discussing, for agreeing, for disagreeing, and so on and so forth, this is a much more natural use of the language, and this can lead to higher motivation in students, especially students who are not particularly fond of analysis and the breaking down of the language. The opportunity just to use the language can be highly motivating for learners. And I do think there is some truth in that. As I've mentioned, fluency is more important than accuracy. Accuracy, language classroom; fluency, core subject classroom. An interesting one. Learning is not seen merely as a key to passing an examination. Now, one of the reasons I put this in the presentation is because certainly my experience when I was working in private language schools is that there is very strong emphasis on passing the exam. And what tends to happen as one goes forward, moving forward to things like the Cambridge First Exam, proficiency exam, etc., is that the language focus becomes terribly targeted at language for the exam. So the vocabulary you learn is targeted towards the themes of the exam. And many of you will be familiar with, not all of you will be familiar with what those themes are. And if you're not, exam bodies, of course, always release the topics that they cover. So whether the exam's an international exam or the Russian national exam, there will be specific topics that are likely to come up, and that will lead teachers and students, understandably, this isn't a criticism, understandably into focusing on areas that are likely to be covered in the exam, composition styles, so on and so forth. And what happens, unfortunately, then is certain other aspects of language tend to get relegated to kind of secondary importance. What Clil does, of course, is it allows language to not be concerned about that. It allows the language use, as I said, to be natural, and it does not limit the focus of the language to just passing the exam, as it were. So that can be quite refreshing, and also, of course, it increases learners' breadth of language, which is very important too. Certainly, exams matter. No one's arguing with that. But at the same time, it is important that if we can, we do broaden the scope and sometimes just let go of the control of the language and let learners explore language that they find interesting as well. And by the way, just to finish this point, that will feed back into examinations. It is not lost language. The structures, the ideas, the fluency will feed back into the language and make learners hopefully more confident users generally of the language that they're learning. Another aspect of Clil, of course, is that it does help prepare students for future studies and or their life at work, because the skills that they learn are not just tightly exam focused. Our learners will learn skills, and I'll talk about these more in a few minutes. They will pick up skills that will enable them if, for example, they go to study full-time or part-time in another country. even if they attend things like international conferences for business or whatever, students are more likely to have come across language that is appropriate for those situations, and also to develop general language skills that are appropriate for such places. And again, I'll give you some more practical information about that in just a few minutes. If we are focusing on Clil, there's more likely to be a diversity of methods used and types of teaching. So it won't just be stuck in the course book, reading comprehension, grammar, listening activity, etc. There will be things like more discussion. There'll be things like project work. There will be writing work, but writing to support a point of view. There will be things like research going on. So there'll be skills coming in that, and methods of teaching that are a little bit more diverse than maybe if we just stuck on a traditional English language coursebook. Bilingualism is the aim of Clil, and this is what the original theory was arguing for. Certainly, if you start looking at core subjects at younger ages, if you take it right down the curriculum, then I do think that there is an argument that learners will learn to be comfortable in both their own native language and the foreign language that they're studying. I have to add that that only would work if learners are exposed to the language intensively at a young age. Once you get over a certain age, I think it's arguable that true bilingualism is not going to happen, even though fluency is still going to take place. Many of you, if you've met me, you will know that my teaching experience, my teaching of English as a foreign language, and in fact where I live, was done in Greece, and I still live in Greece. I'm British, but I still live in Greece. And I'm fluent in Greek. I would not say that I'm bilingual, because I started learning the language in my early 20s, not when I was at school, unfortunately. And so although when I'm at home, it is my everyday language, I wouldn't say that I was bilingual. Very comfortable, but not bilingual. So this concept of bilingualism is very interesting, but it does have, I believe, a number of kind of criteria attached to it. And that is basically the younger you start learning the language and you're exposed to the language, the more likely you are to develop those kind of bilingual skills. So there's that, and I just pressed something, I don't know what I did, never mind. Also, there's this idea of increased motivation, which we discussed again in the first session, that if learners maybe are not interested so much in English as a language, as an academic subject, it may be that using English as a means of discussing and learning about something they are interested in may be a motivational factor for them. Have I relatives in Greece? No, I have a dog. All my relatives are in the UK, and I should be seeing them at Christmas, if that answers your question. I do go back, obviously, to see my family regularly. So these are kind of what we expect to be the advantages of Clil as an educational philosophy. There are issues, though, and as I said, I wanted to give you the full picture of this because I don't want to give you the impression that I think it's all a bed of, a garden of roses and that it's easy. We're discussing things as colleague to colleague right now, and I have questions, and other colleagues I've met have questions, and I wanted to share those with you. Not, I have to stress this because we think it's a bad thing, quite the reverse. But it is important when we discuss educational methodology that we are aware that there may be downsides, and we work through those to get to where we want to be. Certainly, if you're going to use Clil in a broader school system, there does have to be cooperation between the language teacher and the core subject teacher. And by that we mean, so if we take my example of history, if you're going to get learners to talk about history, it's probably a good idea that before they do so, they have covered things like past tenses, sequencing of tenses, things when we use past simple, when we use past perfect, so on and so forth, continuous and simple tenses. Because these are important when we're talking about and writing about historical events. Also things like linkers, showing temporal connections, before, after, etc. So what would have to happen is that the language teacher would have to make sure that they cover those in depth, so that when they go into the history lesson, they are able to use this language, because it is not the history teacher's job to teach things like this. So there has to be a certain amount of coordination. Now, we should always cooperate with our colleagues, and I am going to take that as a logical thing that we all understand and agree on. We're all professionals. Working with our colleagues is something we should be happy to do. But in all honesty, it's very much, again, a question of time and availability and being able to coordinate and discuss, knowing who's teaching what, where, and when, and being able to adapt your lessons to support that. And that is quite a lot of work. I'm going to be honest with you there. Another problem with Clil, to a certain extent in some countries, is this lack of clear guidance. An example that I use very regularly, and I would like to share it with you now because it exemplifies this point completely, is a few years ago I was in the Middle East doing a seminar on English language teaching. During the seminar, I noticed a group of, I'm going to call them young men, because that's what they were, who didn't necessarily seem to be reacting quite as regularly as the other English teachers were. That they seemed not to completely understand what was going on. And they came to me during the break and very politely introduced themselves as teachers of maths, which explained why they weren't necessarily getting everything that I was talking about. And what they explained to me was that they had come along to the seminar because they had a question, they had an issue. And what they said to me basically was that their ministry required that from the next academic year, they should be teaching maths in English. And they wanted to know my opinion. Well, first of all, it's not my job to have opinions about what ministries of education say, but I was trying to respond to them as a professional, and obviously these gentlemen needed help. They'd sat through 45 minutes of something they didn't understand, and so I wished to help them, and I said, okay, so what have the government told you? What guidance have they given you? And they said, well, basically nothing. They said, we've been basically told that we are to teach maths as we've always taught maths, but from now on we have to teach it in English. So there was no guidance, there was no retraining, there was no help from their particular ministry. And I said, so what are you going to do? And they said, well, we know what's going to happen. We shall continue teaching maths in Arabic, and if the inspector comes to visit, then we'll turn it into English until the inspector goes away again, and then we'll continue teaching in Arabic. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't know what happened to that program, and I didn't have any further contact with these gentlemen. But it does point out a very serious problem. If you're going to use Clil to teach core subjects in the foreign language, in our case English, you have to have core subject teachers who are experienced enough in the foreign language to be able to teach that subject in English. Now, many teachers in the world who teach core subjects like maths, geography, history, so on and so forth, are excellent teachers in their field, but not necessarily gifted or experienced linguistically. They may not speak English at all. And what are you going to do in that particular case? Because it's not just a question of teaching them English, it is a question of teaching them English in such a way that they can deliver their subject to their students and that their students will be able to understand what is going on. And so in many countries, this idea of Clil didn't really proceed, quite simply because there was not the ability to retrain teachers or to train new teachers coming into the system to work in this fashion, because it does depend on that. And I think that's a very important point. So there's the question of training and of clear guidance from ministries of education. Ability of time. It's a question. The question there is really very simply, if I have to teach, again, let's take something which is very language heavy, like history. And if I have to teach history in a foreign language to students working in a foreign language, are they capable of doing it at the same pace that they would be able to do it in their native language? Now, if they're bilingual, theoretically, yes. If they're not bilingual, there may be a slight reduction in the speed in which I can introduce the content of my lesson and my learners can work with it. It's a question and it's out there. I don't pretend to have the answer to that. But certainly it is a fair question, and I do think at some point it should be answered. So this would come down to flexibility of curriculum. If, for example, you wished it to be taught in a foreign language, Maybe the curriculum has to be slightly reduced. The content that has to be delivered may need to be reduced slightly. Maybe certain things will disappear or moved to a later year, something like this, to take account for the fact that it's done in a foreign language. Teachers' flexibility, same thing applies. A teacher does have to deliver content, but they have to be able to understand if their students are comprehending or not. And if their students are not comprehending, the teacher would have to have the linguistic skills to be able to reframe, rephrase what they're saying so that their learners can pick up on it. My next point, everybody's favorite, to not sort of pick up another issue is this idea of testing. If you learn, for example, science in English, what language should your test be in? If you've learned your terminology, if you've learned everything in English, should you be tested, for example, here in Russia, should you be tested in Russian if you've learned it in English? It's a debate and it's a fair question. If you learn it in one language and you're tested in another, are you being put at a disadvantage? Again, these are issues that come with it because, as we know, tests are a part of life. And there are questions raised by people about the quality of the learner's native tongue. If too much emphasis is being placed on learning a foreign language, people ask, what happens to their ability to communicate effectively and well in their own language, their composition skills, their speaking skills, etc. Because, of course, it is important that learners, they pick up the speaking from their home environment, etc., but that they learn to communicate professionally and well in their own language. The foreign language is not the only thing that has to be learned, and some people raise questions about that. Two final questions before we move into what we suggest as a compromise is this. This is a question basically from me. I believe, and it has been my experience, that not everybody is good at everything. Some people, putting it very bluntly, are good at languages. Some people are good at maths, sciences, sports, woodwork, whatever it may happen to be. People have different strengths. And I do wonder, for example, if I'm not terribly linguistically gifted, but at the same time, if I am terribly gifted, let's say in history, and I love history and I will be excellent at history, but you make me learn it through a foreign language, what happens then? That concerns me because I genuinely believe that all learners have different gifts, and it's the job of educators to certainly help us where we're weak and build up and strengthen to the best they can areas where we're weak, absolutely. But that as individuals, we all have talents, we all have gifts, and it's important that we're allowed to explore those to the fullest extent. So I do wonder if you make me do it in a way that I'm not particularly inclined to, if you're putting me at a disadvantage or not. My other big question is this. When Clil first came out as a broad school theory, the questions were asked because a lot of this arose because a lot of people said, well, the language that's taught in schools doesn't necessarily lead to good communication skills. And quite rightly, that question was raised, and quite rightly that issue was worried about, because under older systems of teaching language, certainly communication was not necessarily the focus. I would argue now, of course, most of you, ladies and gentlemen, are teaching far more communicatively than you did in the past. We have things like the Common European Framework of Reference that has come out. Many the ministries of education in many countries throughout the world now are putting the emphasis much more on communication, the use of language. Even international exams focus much more on use rather than academic knowledge about. And I think the language teaching world has definitely changed since the early 90s when this theory was first put forward. Does that mean I'm against it? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we think it's a bad idea? Absolutely not. There is a huge amount to be gained. What we're looking at these days is, if you like, a fresh look at Clil and a way of taking the amazingly wonderful elements of it, the great elements, the motivational elements, the development of linguistic skill elements, and using those in a way that can fit within an existing educational structure, so that we don't have to redo the educational structure from the beginning to take advantage of this particular idea. What tends to happen these days is that Clil is approached in the language classroom. There are some places around the world that are still using Clil programs. I do know of a couple of countries that we're working with at the moment who are teaching some core subjects in English. But I would stress that these are part of very specific programs. They're not this kind of, just teach it in English. They're part of teacher training programs. They're part of programs which are piloted at the moment, and they're being done very properly and very seriously, and we're very happy to be part of those programs. But in more general school system at the moment, that's not the case. Still, most language is confined to the language classroom. If you are looking at Clil across a broader school, Clil is always going to be a kind of, it's going to be like any other subject. It's going to depend on what needs to be taught, that is the curriculum in the school, the time available. Clil is also kind of possibly lends itself to certain subjects and not quite so much others, for example. And so where Clil could be used is a matter of debate. Whether it should be used for history or geography or science or whatever is a matter of debate. What tends to happen these days is that Clil and the concepts are used in the language classroom. Now, in front of you, you will see a survey, a report from Clil, looking at exactly this particular subject. What you have in the red box in the middle of this table is kind of where we are now and the areas that are being most explored. It's kind of a compromised position. It's what's known as, in many cases, soft Clil. So it is language teaching that uses content to develop language skills. Its main focus is still the development of linguistic skills, but it also uses content to further those goals. It's still viewed as language teaching, but it uses subject areas as well. And it is taught by the language teacher, not by the core subject teacher. This is a very important point as well. So that now we've kind of got this compromised position that will allow us to use the benefits and not have to worry about some of the drawbacks. And this is what I'll give you some examples of as we go through now. Schools, of course, are free to choose what they want. What strong Clil is kind of the core subjects taught in English. Weak Clil is where we just basically in school teach the language and we don't worry about the content. And then there's this kind of compromised Clil where we use content to achieve language learning. And that is where we are at the moment. There is a couple of factors, sorry, these are cartoons that we found and we've used. There are a couple of factors that always have to be borne in mind whenever we're teaching anything, a different style of teaching, using a different technique. Obviously, students' linguistic level is an issue. We cannot teach content that is at a linguistic level higher than the students, obviously, because there they don't learn the content and they will not learn the language. So we have to be sensitive to where our learners are linguistically in terms of the school system. And also we have to be aware of our students' cognitive level. So we have to be very careful which concepts, which content and concepts we teach in English so that our students are actually capable of understanding them, and understanding them not in terms of the language, but in terms of the concept itself. So in schools, even in our native language, there is a kind of order to which we learn things. And if we're going to teach content and English together, we have to still be aware of that. We're not going to rush to difficult concepts if we're teaching through Clil at primary level. We have to be very, very careful. Victoria, I'm just coming on to your point. Thank you very much for that. And this is precisely what we're going to discuss in just a few minutes. So there has to be a kind of leveling. We have to be aware of where they are linguistically and cognitively before we get into this process. These are taken from I Wonder, just to show you the kind of thing I mean. What we do in I Wonder is to take the Clil approach, but are very much aware of the linguistic and cognitive level. So very simple discussions, very simple facts, very simple information. This is taken from a unit on food, merely for demonstration purposes. We don't get into huge amounts of reading, for example, lots of block text on certain subjects. In the unit on reading, we discuss, sorry, in the unit on food, key, in the unit on food, we discuss, as you do in all English language course books, different types of food. But what we don't do is stop at kind of the names of food at that level. We explore it more deeply. We look at things like, is tomato a fruit or a vegetable? It's an age-old debate. Scientifically, it's a fruit, everybody. You probably know that. Although it's pretty much used as a vegetable, scientifically, it's a fruit. And what we do there, having that discussion with learners, is open their minds that, you know, maybe this is something they didn't know. Maybe this is something they want to find out about and chat about it. The little bluebird there is from another unit where we're looking at colors, etc. And again, it's just getting learners to be curious about things. So just for those few seconds when we discuss these things, we take the emphasis off the learning of language and get into the learning of ideas, of facts, discussing it with our learners, opening their minds, making them a little curious. And if I remember correctly, no, the bluebird cannot see blue, if I remember the fact. Now, colleague Victoria says here, she brings up the term CALP and BICS. This is a very important point. Research that was done on foreign language learning pointed out that most of the emphasis tended to be on BICS. BICS, you'll see there, basic interpersonal communication skills. These are the things we learn in the general language classroom. So we learn to get around, to talk to people, to get information, to deal with things in language, which is fine. But what was missing, they decided, was this idea of CALP, which is cognitive academic language proficiency. This idea of not just terminology, although that's part of it, but the ability to discuss things or write about things in a more scientific kind of way. So using more rational language, using more logic, using evidence within our writing and our speaking. For example, using simple structures like comparison, classification, identifying where things belong. These are skills that are necessary as well when we're learning language. And one of the great things that Clil can do is it can bring in those linguistic areas in a way that learners can handle and focus just a little bit more on the CALP, the cognitive academic language proficiency, as well as, of course, still building up their interpersonal communication skills. So what the learners get is more, it's broader language, but language skills that are applicable and will be applicable in many contexts later on. This is just an example from my one that I wanted to share it with you because I love it. What you get, you can see it's designed to be very colorful, very accessible to learners. I love the thing on the first page there, just under that face, where it informs learners that carrots are not always orange, that there are different kinds of carrots. I'll be honest, before I read this, I didn't know there were purple carrots available. I did not know that. So even I learned something from a primary level book. And what we're doing there is very gently challenging an assumption learners make, giving them just a little bit more information, but I hope we can agree both on the linguistic and cognitive level that primary level learners, and this is the first level of the course, that primary level learners can deal with. And that's exciting because now we're not just learning carrots, apples, etc. We're discussing things, we're finding out information. There is still linguistic emphasis. You can still see on the next page these ideas about the names of things. But what we're also going to do is we discuss the difference between fruit and vegetables. Which of these things are fruit? Which of these things are vegetables? So we learn their names, but we learn a little bit more about them. We're learning to classify. We're learning that certain things belong in certain groups. And that goes into the academic side of the language. I keep pressing the wrong button. The text we keep short. Linguistically, they're not capable of reading too much block text. It's focused, it's about making a smoothie, and it all goes wrong. There is reinforcement of the language learners learn, there is repetition, there is recycling, but it always stays focused on learning about these things. So for example, here, this is a little activity just to show you the kind of thing I'm talking about. Please don't run away with the idea that this is, it's not just about the book. I need to talk to you about the concepts, but it's great to have examples. So for example, here, looking at drawing lines and saying where things grow. So remembering that certain things grow on trees, certain things grow on the ground, certain things grow on a plant, not everything grows on the supermarket shelf. And then, of course, you can extend that. Marina, the series is called I Wonder. I Wonder. What you get here, then, of course, you can extend it. So then you can ask learners, okay, what other fruit and vegetables do you know? Where do they grow? You can shout out, you can point. You don't have to stop here. So we're learning about the world around us, we're connecting it to the world of language, we're understanding that certain things belong in certain groups and that has a scientific nature to it. And it's very, very easy for learners to pick this up. So I want to make it very clear when I said earlier on that I have questions about Clil. I hope you can see what we're trying to do here is give learners an opportunity to use the benefits of that without necessarily getting trapped into some of the drawbacks. Again, here you've got the classification, color the fruit red, color the vegetables green. Very simple, very straightforward. And of course, here we're looking at young learners exams as well, because coloring is also something that's done in those. I'm coming to a close now. I want to just make some final points, and then we may have a couple of minutes for questioning. Why should they develop these skills? Well, if you look here, this is an example from the English National Curriculum. But it also reflects, to be honest, changes in curricula that we're seeing throughout the world. A lot of emphasis these days in developing skills that learners need to develop generally in education, not just in the language classroom. So information processing, thinking things through, making decisions, coming to conclusions, evaluating. These are important skills they need to learn. Reasoning, looking at what I've got, coming to conclusions, not jumping to conclusions, but logically coming to conclusions is important. Inquiry, finding out more. Going away and using the tools available in the modern world to find out more is a wonderful thing. Creative thinking, 21st century, indeed. Victoria, you should come and do a seminar for us. Absolutely brilliant. These are very much 21st century skills. This idea of creative thinking is a 21st century skill. Coming up with solutions, ideas, finding out how things might work. All of these things are wonderful things for learners to learn to do. To evaluate what's a good thing to do, what would be the best thing to do, what might we do now? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? Does this belong to this group or not? All of these things are skills to develop in all subjects, but they're skills that will enable learners to function effectively in the world into which they move. Just a couple more slides. Also, the European competencies for lifelong learning, Clil, and this idea of using content fulfills most of these competencies. In fact, there are a couple more that it doesn't, but it fulfills, I think it's like 6 out of the 8. It encourages communication and talking about things. It encourages basic scientific competencies, things like using the internet for research, maybe, for example, and general scientific thinking, digital competence, learning to learn, learning to find ideas, where we find information, how we record that information, maybe using tools like dictionaries, etc., to explain things to us, maybe going to online encyclopedia to find out more about things. And also as well, looking at different countries, we're looking at food, different ways of cooking things. Where do different things grow? How does that change the cuisine in a particular country? All of these things, for example, there are very important things for learners to do. So the compromise is going to be maybe using Clil in the language classroom. This may lead to things like more project work. We love project work. Go away, find out about, come back and tell us. And that can be something very simple. In the chapter I showed you from I Wonder, they come to conclusions about, for example, things like what is good for our teeth and what is not good for our teeth. And they make a little poster and they talk to the class about things we should eat more of and things we should eat less of and why we should do that. Wonderful things. Encouraging learners to read more too. We have a series, for example, of Clil readers from primary level into secondary level, which discuss facts and provide information that could very nicely lead into projects. You can have projects across the school. The school could look at the environment, our city, and the English class could look at things from an English perspective within that. Geography class could look at another aspect of that. There are a number of ways that we can incorporate further research, further use of language, investigative skills in the classroom. And this is my final slide here, just to finish. Please remember that in the language classroom, not just abstract knowledge, building skills, things that learners can use, research, organizing their thoughts, finding things out. Encourage production, not just reception. Clil is wonderful at that. It gets learners discussing, thinking. Get them to work with each other on projects. Get them to work on their own sometimes. There should be a balance between the two. This encourages learners to use information in a natural way, to synthesize it. So things in the language classroom with the maths, or with the geography, or with the history, we make connections between those things, which reinforces that learning and keeps it in our heads. We allow learners to explore things by themselves, to find things out. We give them the skills, and then they go ahead and do it. And of course, it should be fun. Learning should be fun, ladies and gentlemen. The brain is designed to learn. When the brain's doing what it wants, it feels pleasure. Learning should be pleasure. And Clil will allow us just to take the reins off a little bit and allow our learners to run free and discover and find out and discuss things that they are passionate about. Natalia, και εγώ σας ευχαριστώ. Χαρά μου σήμερα που σε γνώρισα. Thank you very much indeed. If there are any questions, Svetlana, I'm going to put my email. Okay, I'll put my email. Okay, I can put it here. I'm going to give you, I'll use the quick email. I have a longer email, but I'm giving you the quick one because I'm typing it. If you do have any questions or anything, there is my email. I have a business email, but it takes me forever to type it, and I'm frightened of misspelling it. That is the easiest email to find me on. If there are any issues that come up, please drop me a line, either about the methodology or the material. I'm very happy to answer all of them. You want me to do? There are a couple of questions. Give me 30. How do we teach children? Oh gosh, children with autism is a very, very big subject area because it would have to depend on where they are on the particular spectrum. Really can't go into that now. If you would like, Anastasia, drop me a line. My mother happens to be a special needs teacher, and she is terribly good at such things. If you would like, drop me a line, and I can put you in touch with someone who probably knows this much better than me. So Anastasia, please just drop me a line at that email, and I'd be very happy to provide information. I think Clil, there's no limitation on Clil. It's the same with any teaching subject. You have to adapt the way you teach depending if children have particular issues. Clil is no different. And the fact that it's not so black and white, that it's more open-ended, might actually lend itself to certain circumstances to allow learners not to feel like they're failing because they don't get the right answer. But I'm afraid special needs kids is not something we can't discuss right now. It's a fascinating area, and I fully respect your concern, and I fully understand your concern. If you have issues with that, please just drop me a line, and we'll see what we can do there. I have to bring this to a close now. The next session, if you wish just to join us, we're just going to talk about the Young Learners Examination, talk to you a little bit about what it's about, how it can be used in the classroom as a teaching tool. You're very welcome to join us for that if you can stay. If you're not going to stay with us for that, which is perfectly okay as well, thank you so much for being with me today. And again, I hope whatever stage of the day you're in, I hope it goes wonderfully for you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you for your attention, and I hope I'll have the pleasure of your company again soon.